The man in the navy cap sat alone at the corner booth. He stirred his coffee once, twice, watching the steam rise like a ghost and vanish. His jeans were worn, his polo faded, his hands steady. Nothing about him screamed wealth, which were precisely the point. Across the diner, laughter hid behind the hiss of the fryer. A young waitress moved table to table with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When she placed his check down, her hand trembled, just a little. On the paper, scrawled in shaky ink, were 4 letters. Help! She didn't look up, didn't speak, just walked away. The man in the cap blinked once. Then he folded the bill carefully, placed it under his cup, and waited. No one in that room knew the truth. He wasn't just another customer. He owned half the city. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and quiet disappointment. The booths were cracked vinyl, patched with duct tape and history. A jukebox in the corner hummed a song no one had chosen. Fluorescent lights buzzed like lazy bees above peeling wallpaper the color of old lemons. It was a place that had seen better years, maybe better people. 2. Behind the counter, the manager, a man with slick-back hair and the kind of grin that cut more than it comforted, barked orders with unnecessary volume. Table 6, Clarissa. They've been waiting 10 minutes for eggs. You think time grows on trees. The waitress, Clarissa, her name tag heartbroken, whispered an apology and hurried to the kitchen window. Her movements were quick, careful, like someone who'd learned to stay invisible to survive. From the booth, the man in the cap, George, watched quietly. He noticed the way the manager's voice always found her, even when others were slower. He noticed how the cook flinched when the order bell rang too loudly. How no one met anyone's eyes. The diner was a small world of fear, and he could feel it, baked into every wall, every sigh, every forced smile. Clarissa placed 2 plates on a tray and almost slipped on a patch of grease. The manager saw it, smirked, and didn't move to help. Careful, sweetheart, he said. Wouldn't want you breaking more than dishes. The laughter that followed came from another server, nervous, obedient laughter. The kind that said, I don't want to be next. George took a slow sip of his coffee. It tasted like metal and overwork. He'd been in places like this before. Not diners, exactly, but boardrooms that smelled just as rotten. Power always sounded the same, loud, insecure, pretending to be in control. Clarissa passed him again, this time with her hand on her neck as if steadying herself. A bruise, faint but fresh, peeked from beneath her sleeve. George saw it. She caught his glance and looked away fast. Outside, rain gathered at the windows, turning the parking lot into a mirror gray. Inside, the air felt thick with something unspoken. The manager leaned against the counter, flipping through receipts. I tell you, he said to no one in particular, these new hires, they think they are owed something. You give them a job, they give you attitude. That one. He nodded at Clarissa, who was refilling a coffee cup. She's one right up away from being gone. Clarissa froze mid-pour. The old man at her table shifted uncomfortably. No one said anything. George looked down at his phone. Blank screen. No signal. Not yet. Clarissa brought him a refill. Her eyes met his, just for a second. He saw exhaustion, but also calculation. The look of someone who had finally decided that silence was no longer safe. Then she walked away. George unfolded the bill she'd given him. The ink had bled slightly from the humidity, but the word was still clear. Help! He glanced toward the counter. The manager was watching her, not him. The clock ticked above the register. 9:48 a.m. Something was wrong here. Not just cruelty, not just bad management. Something deeper. Controlled. Fear-shaped. George leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. His hand brushed his cap, and for a moment, the light caught the gold band on his watch, expensive, understated, almost hidden beneath his sleeve. Then he whispered, so low it was nearly lost beneath the hum of the diner. All right, Clarissa, let's see what's really going on. Outside, thunder rolled, and that's when the door opened, and someone new walked in. The bell above the door jingled. A man in a cheap gray uniform stepped in, security badge crooked, flashlight clipped to his belt. His shoes squeaked against the linoleum like a warning. The manager's face brightened. Morning, Rick, he said, voice suddenly friendly. Right on time. I had a little issue last night. Might need your expertise again. The word expertise rolled off his tongue like poison. Clarissa froze mid-step near the counter. George saw her shoulders tighten. The young dishwasher in the back, a thin boy no older than 20, quietly turned the water down so he could listen. Rick, the security guard, glanced around the diner like he owned it. What's the problem this time? Shoplifters? Drunks? The manager smirked. Not yet, but you know how it is. Some people around here forget who's in charge. Clarissa set down a plate of pancakes at table 4, her hands trembling just enough that one strawberry slid off the edge. The customer didn't notice, but George did. He watched her mouth move as she whispered to herself. Not a prayer, but a warning she couldn't give aloud. The diner's air thickened. The hiss of the fryer, the drip of the coffee pot, the distant hum of rain outside. All of it felt like it was waiting for something. Rick took a seat at the counter, poured himself coffee without asking. Still in the house. Right, he said. The manager chuckled. Are you kidding? As long as you keep us safe from troublemakers. Clarissa walked past, and the manager's hand brushed her lower back. She stiffened, didn't turn, just whispered, please don't, like someone who'd already learned the cost of saying more. George's jaw tightened. He forced himself to stay still. He wasn't here to explode. He was here to observe. The young dishwasher, Lewis, according to his fading name tag, brought out a tray of clean cups. His eyes darted toward Clarissa, then to George, and back again. He seemed to know something, or at least to feel the shift in the air. When George caught his eye, Lewis looked down fast. Fear, not of George, but of what this place did to people who spoke up. The manager leaned in toward Clarissa at the register. By the way, he murmured, your drawer came up short again yesterday. Her voice shook. It wasn't short, sir. I counted twice. Oh, I'm sure you think you did. His tone dripped with mock sweetness. But I'll need that difference out of your next check. Company policy. I can't. I don't even make. She stopped herself, catching sight of Rick watching. Yes, so. George's spoon clinked against his cup. He didn't drink, just listened. He'd seen it before. The slow erosion of dignity. A place where cruelty wasn't shouted, but whispered until it sounded like truth. Clarissa passed by him again, this time refilling his cup without looking up. Her hand trembled, and George noticed the edge of a folded photo sticking out of a pocket. A little girl, maybe 8, missing a tooth, smiling at a fairground. He knew that kind of picture. The reason is pictures, the ones you keep when life gives you nothing else to fight for. Rick leaned back, tapping his mug. You know, he said to the manager, have you ever thought of upgrading? This place looks like it belongs in a museum. The manager laughed. Tell me about it. I've been trying to get the owner to sell for years. Some old guy bought it decades ago and vanished. Probably dead. George smiled faintly at that. Probably, he said quietly. The manager looked over. What's that old-timer? George lifted his gaze, steady, calm. I said probably. The manager scoffed. Didn't ask for your opinion. Drink your coffee. Lewis, standing by the sink, froze because no one talked to customers like that here. But the man in the cap didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He just looked back down at his cup, letting silence speak louder. Clarissa turned toward the kitchen window again, and for a second, her eyes found his. A tiny, pleading flicker. She mouthed one word. Please. George nodded, almost imperceptibly, and reached for his phone. But before he could type, Rick stood up. Something wrong? Buddy, he asked, swaggering closer. You look tense. George met his stare. Just thinking. About what? George smiled without humor. About how fast people forget who they're talking to. The manager barked out a laugh. Oh, you hear that, Rick? We got ourselves a philosopher. Rick leaned closer, hands on the table. Maybe we got ourselves a problem. Clarissa whispered, please stop, but no one heard her over the tension stretching like a wire. Lewis took a step forward, then stopped, eyes wide. George's voice stayed low, calm, and surgical. You lay another hand on her, or speak to her like that again. He paused, not for effect but for control. And you'll regret it. Deeply. Rick smirked. That a threat, old man? George leaned back, eyes cold now. No, it's a promise. The words hung there, fragile, electric. Then, like that, the moment passed. The manager clapped his hands once. All right, everyone, calm down. This ain't a boxing ring. He turned to Clarissa, smiling the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. See what you started. Clarissa blinked back tears. I didn't. He cut her off. Break's over. Get back to work. She moved like someone holding herself together with a thread. George's gaze followed her. His hand stayed over his phone, thumb hovering. He wanted to press send, to end this farce. But he wasn't done yet. Not until he understood why she'd written help. Then, a crash, a glass slipping from her tray and shattering. The room froze. Every head turned. The manager's voice thundered. That's it. You're done. Clarissa. Her breath caught. Please, it was just... He stepped toward her, finger in her face. Out. Pack your things. Rick folded his arms, blocking the exit. George stood slowly, chest scraping the floor. All eyes turned toward him. His voice, when it came, was calm. Too calm. You might want to think very carefully, he said, about what you do next. The manager sneered. Who do you think you are? George's answer was simple. Someone who's been watching. The diner went silent. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Outside, lightning flashed, washing the windows in white. Inside, something far more dangerous was about to break. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of rain deepened against the glass, a dull, relentless rhythm, like the heartbeat of something waiting to snap. The manager straightened his tie, forcing a grin. You've been watching, huh? What are you, some kind of health inspector? George didn't answer. He just studied the man. The slick hair, the sweat forming at his temple, the brittle confidence cracking beneath it. Clarissa stood near the counter, clutching her apron. Her lips trembled, but her eyes, those were steady now. The kind of steadiness that comes when fear has run its course and turned into resolve. Rick moved closer, his flashlight handle tapping against his palm. I think the man asked you a question. George tilted his head. You think too much. Rick's smirk faltered, replaced by the kind of frown that only bullies wear when someone doesn't play along. You want to keep mouthing off, or you want to leave quietly. George's tone stayed level. Why would I leave? My food hasn't even come out. Clarissa whispered, Sir, please. Rick stepped forward. That's it. He reached for George's arm. The diner held its breath. George didn't move at first. Then, with a single practice motion, he shifted aside, and Rick's hand met only air. The guard stumbled, catching himself in a chair. The motion was clean, effortless, too effortless for a man past his prime. Careful, George said softly. Wouldn't want anyone to get hurt. Rick's face flushed red. You think you can just waltz in here. But the manager cut in, his voice tight now. Enough. Rick, get him out. Clarissa's voice cracked. Don't, please. You don't understand. The manager turned on her. You're fired. I told you to keep quiet, not play a hero. Lewis set down his tray, trembling. She didn't do anything. The room spun into motion, voices rising, chairs scraping, anger blooming like wildfire. Rick lunged again, this time grabbing George by the sleeve. That's when something small fell from George's pocket, a wallet opening on impact. Inside, visible for half a heartbeat, was a silver business card embossed with a single word in raised lettering. Morrow. The manager froze. His smirk faltered. He'd seen that name before, plastered on skyscrapers, shipping trucks, foundations. The Morrow Group, a company that could buy 100 diners like this and forget by lunchtime. Rick blinked. What's that supposed to? George calmly picked it up, dusted it off, and tucked it back into his pocket. You should be very careful, he said, voice low, how you treat people when you think no one's watching. The manager's mouth opened, closed, then found familiar defense, arrogance. You trying to scare me with a name? Please. You're just some washed-up exec who thinks it's still important. George's eyes flicked toward Clarissa. She stood frozen, the word help echoing silently between them. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not cruelly, sadly. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a folded napkin, clean, white. On it, he drew 3 letters with the corner of his coffee spoon, using the condensation's ink. B47. A simple code. He placed it beneath his cup, like a man leaving a tip. Then, quietly, he said, "I'll be right back." The manager barked, "You're not going anywhere." But George was already moving toward the door, slow, deliberate. As he reached it, he stopped beside Clarissa. "You did the right thing," he whispered. "Now, stay close to Lewis." She blinked. "What's happening?" "Justice," he said, in real time. He stepped out into the rain. Minutes passed. The diner buzzed in confusion. Rick muttered under his breath, pacing by the counter. The manager pretended not to be shaken, but he kept glancing at the window. Clarissa stood near the sink, her chest tight, unsure whether to cry or run. Then, headlights. A black SUV pulled up, its engine too smooth for a patrol car, too quiet for delivery. The rain glistened across its hood like mercury. 2 men stepped out in dark suits. No badges, no nonsense. They moved like they didn't need permission. The doorbell jingled again. "Morning," said the first one, calm, polite, and efficient. "This is the Haven Diner." The manager blinked. Yeah." The second man showed a small emblem. "We're with Morrow Group Asset Division. We were told to proceed." Clarissa gasped. Lewis dropped a cup. The manager's face was drained of color. "Proceed with what?" The man smiled faintly. "Site evaluation. Effective immediately." Rick stood up. "You can't just..." The first man turned to him, gaze cutting. "Are you employed here?" Rick hesitated. Yeah. Security." "Not anymore." Rick's mouth opened to protest, but the man was already looking past him, scanning the walls, the kitchen, the leaking ceiling tile. Unsafe working conditions, falsified labor logs, multiple violations. "We've had reports." The manager stammered. "Reports? From who?" The man looked over his shoulder, just as George stepped back through the door, rain glistening on his cap. Calm, composed. The storm followed him in. "From me," George said simply. The room went silent. The fry cook stopped mid-motion. The old man at table 2 put down his fork. Every breath in the diner seemed to freeze. The manager swallowed hard. You're with Morrow Group." George removed his cap and set it on the counter. His voice was quiet but carried through every corner of the room. "I am Morrow Group." No one spoke. Not the manager, not Rick, not even the rain. Clarissa covered her mouth. Lewis whispered, "Oh my God." George looked at the manager, not angry, just tired. "You said the owner was dead. You were almost right." Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded bill Clarissa had written on, help still visible, slightly smudged by his thumb. "This," he said, laying it flat on the counter, "was the first honest thing that's been handed to me in this diner in years." He turned toward the suited men. "Lock it down." The men nodded and began moving, speaking into earpieces. The manager's voice cracked. "Wait, you can't. This is a misunderstanding." George looked at him once more. "No, this is clarity." And for the first time, the cool laughter, the greasy confidence, all of it vanished. Outside, thunder rolled again. Inside, the power shifted. For a long, trembling second, no one moved. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silence, uneven and sharp, like the sound of guilt itself. The manager's mouth opened, but no words came. His smirk was gone, replaced by the fragile mask of a man realizing he'd been shouting at the one person who could erase him with a sentence. George set his cap down beside the bill. Rain dripped from its brim. His hair, silvered at the temples, caught the flicker of the lights. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with anger, It was with weary certainty. "This diner," he said, his voice low, "was the first business I ever bought. 19 years old, broke, but hungry. I built this place to give people a start. People like I used to be. People who just needed one chance." Clarissa stood frozen, eyes wide, hands clasped over her apron. The young dishwasher, Lewis, took half a step forward, his lips parting in disbelief. George continued, steady as stone. "I left it under management when the company grew. Trusted it would be treated right. That you," he looked directly at the manager, "would treat people right." The manager shook his head, a desperate laugh catching in his throat. You can't just walk in here and what?" George's tone didn't rise. "Expect decency." Rick looked between them, his earlier swagger evaporating. "I didn't know, man. I was just—" "You were just doing your job," George finished softly. "That's what they all say before the cameras roll." The suited men began taking photographs. Grease stains on the floor, loose wiring near the stove, the outdated safety logs pinned crooked to the wall. One of them lifted a folder from the counter, flipping it open. "Payroll discrepancies. Unrecorded hours. Threatened staff. Looks like you've been busy." The manager's face blanched. "That's not— You don't—" Clarissa's voice broke through, quiet but clear. "It's true. He takes from our checks. Makes us work doubles without overtime. Lewis was sick last week. He docked his pay for leaving early." Lewis nodded, trembling but resolute. He said I'd be replaced if I told anyone. Rick muttered something under his breath, but the suited man beside him cut him off. "You can leave your badge on the counter, sir." Rick hesitated, then did. The manager turned back to George, voice cracking. "Look, I didn't know it was yours. All right? I was just—" George's gaze didn't waver. "It shouldn't matter whose name is on the building." He turned toward Clarissa. "You wrote that word. Help. Why?" Her lip quivered. I didn't think anyone would see it. I couldn't take it anymore." He kept saying no one cared. That people like us didn't matter. I guess I wanted proof that maybe someone still did. George nodded slowly. "You gave it to me." She blinked, tears welling. "I thought you were just another customer." "I was," he said gently, "the kind that still believes people are worth saving." He looked back at the manager. "Call your lawyer. The diners are under investigation for labor violations, harassment, and fraud. Effective immediately, you're relieved of duty." The manager sputtered. "You can't do that." The suited man beside George handed him a printed document. "Actually, sir, he already has." George slid the paper across the counter. The man's own signature, forged on multiple expense statements, stared back at him. The color drained completely from his face. "How?" "Because I built this company," George said, "and I still remember every corner that bears my name." He turned to Clarissa and Lewis. "You, too. Step outside for a moment. There's something I want you to see." They hesitated, unsure if it was real, but George's expression was calm, reassuring. They followed. The rain had eased to a soft drizzle. The black sub's headlights glowed against the wet pavement. Another vehicle pulled up, this one white, with the Morrow Foundation logo printed across its door. Volunteers stepped out carrying boxes and folders. Clarissa frowned. "What is this?" George smiled faintly. "What happens next?" He looked toward the diner through the window, the manager pacing, shouting silently into his phone. Inside, men like him thought they could run the world in fear. Out here, we'll rebuild it on dignity. Lewis swallowed hard. "You're really the owner?" George nodded. "And for the record, you're both reinstated, with back pay." Clarissa covered her mouth, shaking her head. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay," George said softly. "Help me fix what I let rot." Thunder rumbled far off, fading now into the distance, as if the storm itself was retreating. Inside, the officials moved efficiently. Evidence boxed, locks changed, cameras rolling for documentation. The once loud diner now sat in quiet reckoning. When George finally walked back in, every eye turned to him. The manager, sweating, muttered, "You're making a mistake." George's answer was almost kind. "No, I'm correcting one." He looked at Clarissa again, his voice low, almost tender. "Thank you for being brave when I wasn't watching." And then he said the words that shifted everything. "Proceed." The suits nodded, and the Morrow Group takeover officially began. The lights flickered once. The rain outside slowed. And in that still moment, everyone who had once laughed, lied, or looked away knew the truth had finally arrived. The diner that once hummed with quiet cruelty now pulsed with silence, a silence of reckoning. The kind that comes only when people realize the mirror has turned back on them. George stood by the counter, cap in hand. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low but carried across every booth. "Before we fix anything, we clean it." The suits moved with quiet precision. One spoke softly into an earpiece. "Legal team confirmed. Documents authenticated. Proceeding with compliance audit." The manager sputtered, his hands trembling over a pile of receipts. "You can't just barge in here with your goons. You can't take my business." George looked at him evenly. "It was never your business. It was your responsibility. And you failed at it." Rick, now standing near the door with his head low, muttered, "I was just following orders." George turned slightly toward him. "That excuse has built empires and graves. Rick, the world doesn't need more men who just follow orders. It needs men who know when to stop." Rick's throat bobbed. He set his flashlight down on the counter, quietly, as though laying down a weapon. "I'm sorry," he said, not loudly, but honestly. George nodded. "Then start again somewhere else. Better." He didn't look away as the suits escorted the manager toward the office, where files were being sealed and locks replaced. Clarissa and Lewis watched from the side, unsure whether to step forward or hide. One of the suited men handed George a thick folder. "Sir, this confirms the violations. Multiple wage thefts, safety code breaches, health inspection falsifications. We'll file charges." George sighed. "Don't press for prison, just recovery and reform. Let him live with the weight of what he broke." The man nodded, surprised, but didn't argue. The manager's voice cracked from the back office. "You think you're better than me, huh? You with your fancy suit and hidden cameras. You think you care about these people? You don't even know their names." George turned, slow and calm. "You're right. I didn't. That's on me." He looked at Clarissa. "But I'll learn from them. Starting now." She blinked back tears. "You don't have to." "I do," he said. "Because power doesn't mean you get to forget the people who hold the walls up." Lewis stepped forward, his hands still damp from dishwater. "Mr. Morrow, you really came here pretending? Just to see how things were?" George's eyes softened. "I came here to remember. Somewhere along the way, I started measuring success in dollars instead of decency. This place reminded me how expensive kindness has become." Outside, a crowd had started to form. Word was spreading fast. The Morrow Group CEO, Undercover, exposing his own managers. Cameras clicked through the windows. But inside, George wasn't thinking about headlines. He was thinking about the bruise on Clarissa's arm, the fear in Lewis's voice, the smell of burnt coffee that no one had dared to complain about because at least it worked. He turned to one of the suited men. "Get HR down here. Start reviewing every employee. Anyone complicit in this culture. Gone. Everyone who endured it gets the first chance of promotion and fair pay." Clarissa's mouth fell open. "You mean we're keeping our jobs?" "More than that," George said. "You're going to help rebuild this place. New leadership, new rules, no more shouting, no more fear." Lewis exhaled, a sound like release. "I don't even know what to say." "Say you'll show up tomorrow," George replied. "This time, with hope." The manager was escorted out, rain dripping from his collar, his defiance finally drowned. Reporters called out his name, but he couldn't meet their eyes. The once proud face of control now looked small beneath the diner's flickering sign. Clarissa stood beside George as they watched him go. "He made us all feel like we were nothing." George nodded. He forgot that nothing is what every great story starts from. He turned to the remaining staff. This place will close for renovations. 2 weeks. Everyone gets full pay for that time. And when it reopens, the sign will still say Haven Diner. Because that's what it was supposed to be. Clarissa smiled weakly through tears. A haven. George looked around the room, at the empty booths, the cracked tiles, the ghost of laughter that had once meant something. Yeah, he said. It's time it lived up to the name. That evening, after the officials left, George sat alone in the same booth he'd started in. Steam rose from a fresh cup of coffee, stronger now, richer, as though even the air had begun to change. Clarissa approached, no longer trembling. They had gone, she said. All of them. George nodded. Good. She hesitated. You didn't have to do all this. He looked up, tired eyes soft. Neither did you. But you did. You wrote one word. Help. And because of it, everyone in this building gets another chance. She looked down at the table. I almost didn't. I know, he said quietly. Courage doesn't always rule. Sometimes it's written in ink and handed to a stranger. A faint smile tugged at her lips. You really are who you said you were. He sipped his coffee, smiling just enough to let mystery linger. Let's just say I'm someone who used to forget where he came from. Outside, the night had calmed. The neon sign flickered once more before going dark. Ready for the morning, it would be reborn. The rain had stopped. Inside, the air was lighter, like the first breath after years of holding it. George reached for the check, but Clarissa caught his hand. This one's on the house, she said. He chuckled softly. No, this one's in the future. 2 weeks later, the Haven Diner reopened, not with balloons or headlines, but with a quiet sound of new beginnings. The sign outside gleamed brighter, its rusted edges replaced, its light steady for the first time in years. And inside, the smell of fresh coffee met the morning sun. Clarissa adjusted her apron, a new one, crisp and clean, the name tag shining. The same hands that once trembled now moved with confidence. The diner looked different, but the biggest change wasn't the polished counters or fixed lights. It was a people. Lewis leaned on the counter, flipping pancakes with a hum under his breath. I never thought I'd miss this place, he said, grinning. Clarissa smirked. That's because you didn't miss this place. You miss what it could have been. He nodded, sliding her a plate. Guess we finally got it. At exactly 8 a.m., the door opened, and George walked in. No cap this time, just a light jacket and a quiet smile. Still the same man, but somehow lighter. Morning, he said, looking around. Clarissa smiled. You're early. He chuckled, force of habit. The other staff paused, watching him, unsure how to address him now. CEO? Boss? Friend? George broke the tension first. I'm not here to check up on you. Just to eat. Lewis laughed. You're the first boss I've ever seen come back for breakfast. George took his usual booth. Maybe that's where most of them get it wrong. Clarissa poured his coffee, steady hand, no fear. She noticed his tie tucked loosely, not a single hint of boardroom stiffness. You really meant it, huh? She asked. All the changes, the pay, the hours, the new policy about managers. He looked up at her. Promises don't mean much until they turn into routine. That's where the real work starts. She smiled softly. Well, it's working. People laugh now. No one flinches when the phone rings. George nodded, his gaze warm. Good. Then maybe we're finally feeding more than our stomachs. Through the window, the street buzzed. People were talking about the diner, the story, the man who went undercover. But inside, everything felt still, human, simple. A young waitress, new hire, approached nervously with a notepad. Mr. Morrow? Sorry, sir, I just wanted to say thank you for giving people like us a chance. George smiled gently. Don't thank me. Thank the people who reminded me why this place matters. He looked at Clarissa as he said it. The girl blushed, nodding. Still, not many would have done what you did. George sipped his coffee, thoughtful. Then maybe it's time more people did. Later that morning, As he stood to leave, Clarissa walked him to the door. "You will come back again, right?" she asked. He smirked. "You're serving better coffee now. You won't be able to keep me away." They both laughed, but as he stepped out, Clarissa's tone softened. "George, I never asked. Why me? Out of all the people who could have written that note, why'd you listen?" He paused, hand on the door. "Because you didn't write for yourself. You wrote for everyone. And people like that, they deserve to be heard." Outside, the sun broke through clouds. Inside, the diner came alive with sound. Orders shouted playfully, laughter echoing, the clatter of dishes that no longer carried attention. Louis called out from the kitchen, "Clarissa, another table's asking for you." "Coming," she said, her voice bright and sure. She turned to look once more at the empty booth where George had Saturday. On the table, he'd left a small folded note under his cup. She opened it. Just one line. "The best leaders start as listeners." Gee. Her eyes glistened, but her smile held firm. Outside, George walked down the street, another man blending into the crowd. No cameras, no entourage. Just a man who remembered where he came from. And behind him, the neon sign of the diner glowed steady and strong. Haven Diner under new management, built on kindness. Morning light drifts across his face, calm, reflective, human. No shoot, no boardroom, just a man who's seen both sides of the counter. His voice comes soft, steady, part narration, part confession. You learn a lot about people when they think you're nobody. You see who leads with kindness and who measures worth by a name tag. He pauses at a crosswalk, watching a delivery driver unload boxes. The man's back is hunched, his shirt stained with effort, but he hums under his breath, smiling anyway. George smiles back. We build systems that reward efficiency and forget empathy. We talk about growth, but not grace. And sometimes it takes a note, written in fear, passed with trembling hands, to remind us what humanity sounds like. Flashbacks ripple across the screen. Clarissa slipping the folded receipt. Her eyes, terrified, pleading, the moment George looked down and saw the word help. That one word changed more than a shift. It changed the culture. It reminded me that leadership isn't about control. It's about courage, the kind it takes to speak when silence feels safer. He stops by a park bench, watching children chase each other across the grass. Their laughter cuts through the noise of the city. When we stop listening to the quiet ones, the world starts to rot from the inside. Dignity isn't something you own at the top. It's something you protect from wherever you stand. He takes off his cap and sets it beside him, the same one he wore that first day in the diner. For a long moment, he just sits. Then, quietly, I wasn't there to test him. I was there to remember what I'd forgotten. The narration slows, turning intimate, almost like a letter. So next time you walk into a place, a diner, an office, a store, look around. Ask yourself who's surviving and who's being silenced. Because sometimes the person who needs help isn't asking for rescue. They're asking for someone to notice. He stands, slipping the cap back on, and turns toward the camera. A faint smile crosses his face. When you see wrong, do you stay quiet, or do you stand up